The camera was never supposed to matter. It was installed for safety, a silent witness meant to deter crime, not record it. But on that night, it captured something no one in the neighborhood was prepared to see. A few minutes of footage would later tear apart the illusion of safety, expose a brutal truth, and change how everyone saw the quiet street they called home. At first glance, the neighborhood looked ordinary. Neatly parked cars, dim porch lights, a calm that felt permanent. People here believed serious violence happened elsewhere, far from their doors. They waved at each other, trusted familiar faces, and slept without fear. That sense of comfort would not survive the night. The incident began without warning. No sirens, no screams loud enough to alert the entire block. Just movement caught on a security camera, the kind most people scroll past, without a second thought. A figure enters the frame, then another. What happens next unfolds quickly, brutally, and without mercy. When police later reviewed the footage, even seasoned investigators struggled to watch it more than once. The attack was fast, deliberate, and shockingly public. There was no attempt to hide from the camera, no hesitation, no visible remorse. The violence didn't explode out of chaos. It arrived with intention. The victim was someone people recognized, a familiar face, a neighbor, someone who had walked these streets countless times without incident. That familiarity made the footage even harder to process. This wasn't a random stranger passing through. This was someone whose life ended in a place that once felt safe. As the footage spread among investigators, a disturbing pattern emerged. The attacker didn't appear panicked. There was no frantic movement, no confusion. Every step suggested planning. The way they approached, the way they stood, the way they left the frame afterward. Calm, controlled, almost routine. By the time emergency services arrived, it was already too late. The street that had remained quiet for years was suddenly filled with flashing lights, police tape, and stunned residents standing behind their doors, watching their reality fracture. Whispers spread faster than facts. Fear replaced familiarity. Detectives immediately locked onto the camera footage as the key to the case. In modern investigations, video doesn't just show what happened, it shows how. Body language, timing, direction, small details that reveal motive and mindset. And this footage had plenty. Frame by frame, analysts broke it down. The moment the attacker entered view, the angle of approach, the lack of disguise. This wasn't an act fueled by sudden rage. It looked rehearsed, almost inevitable. The kind of crime that begins long before the first blow. As officers canvassed the neighborhood, they noticed something unsettling. Very few people had heard anything. Doors were closed, windows were shut. The violence occurred in plain sight, yet almost entirely unnoticed. It was a reminder of how isolation can exist even in crowded places, how crimes can unfold silently while life continues just feet away. Neighbors struggled with guilt. Some replayed the night in their minds, wondering if they had missed a sound, a shadow, a sign. Others questioned how well they really knew the people around them. Trust, once automatic, now felt dangerous. The footage didn't just capture the crime. It captured the failure of assumptions, the belief that familiarity equals safety, the belief that danger announces itself loudly, the belief that cameras alone can prevent violence. None of that held true anymore. As the investigation progressed, detectives began tracing the attacker's movements before and after the crime. The camera network revealed a path, not just a moment. Each clip added context, where they came from, where they went, how long they lingered. The story expanded beyond a single act into a timeline of intent. The victim's final moments became the center of the case. But detectives were careful not to reduce a life to footage. They spoke to family members, friends, co-workers. They built a picture of who the victim was beyond that night. Someone with routines, plans, a future that ended abruptly and violently. Public reaction intensified once authorities confirmed the role of surveillance footage. The idea that such brutality had been recorded unsettled people deeply. Some found comfort in knowing the truth was captured. Others felt disturbed by how close they came to witnessing it themselves. Questions filled the air. Who was the attacker? Why here? Why now? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how many other cameras had recorded warning signs that no one noticed? As leads developed, police focused on identifying the figure in the footage. Clothing, gait, physical build. Every detail mattered. Even the way the person walked suggested familiarity with the area. This was not someone lost or wandering. This was someone who knew exactly where they were. What began as a shocking video soon transformed into a deeper investigation of human behavior, of anger that simmers quietly, of grudges that grow unseen, of violence that doesn't always erupt suddenly, but builds patiently, waiting for the right moment. By the end of the first 48 hours, the neighborhood was no longer just a crime scene. It was a symbol, a reminder that danger doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it's already there, blending in, waiting to be revealed. Not by screams but by a silent camera that never looked away. And as detectives prepared to confront the person responsible, one thing became clear. The footage had shown how the crime happened. What it had not yet revealed was the full truth behind why it happened. A truth that would prove even more disturbing than the images themselves. The moment investigators identified a potential suspect, the tone of the case shifted. What had begun as a shocking act of violence now became a study of intent. The camera had shown what happened, but not what led to it. To understand that, detectives had to look beyond the footage and into the life of the person who stepped calmly into frame and walked away just as easily. The suspect was not unknown to the area. In fact, that was the most unsettling part. They had moved through the neighborhood before without drawing attention. No red flags, no history that screamed danger. To most people, they were invisible, ordinary, the kind of person no one would ever suspect of committing something so brutal in plain sight. When questioned, the suspect did not immediately break down. There were no dramatic outbursts, no visible panic. Instead, there was distance, short answers, careful pauses, a calm that felt misplaced. Given the severity of the situation, investigators recognized it instantly. Not innocence, but control. As interviews continued, inconsistencies began to surface. Small ones at first, a time that didn't match, a route that didn't make sense, details that shifted just enough to suggest something was being hidden. When confronted with the camera footage, the suspect didn't deny being there. They questioned the interpretation, the angle, the timing, as if facts could be negotiated. Detectives applied pressure, slowly. They let silence do the work. Long pauses filled the room. The suspect filled them with explanations that grew more complicated by the hour. Each attempt to rationalize only tightened the net. Behind the scenes, investigators uncovered a connection between the suspect and the victim. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind people expect. No public feud. No obvious threats. Just a history of unresolved tension, quiet resentment, and personal conflict that had never been addressed openly. The kind of conflict that doesn't explode immediately, but festers. Experts later explained that this type of violence often comes from perceived loss of control, a feeling of being wronged, ignored, humiliated. When those feelings are internalized instead of expressed, they can turn dangerous. The attack wasn't random, it was personal, and it was intentional. The footage was shown to a jury months later, but long before that, it had already reshaped the community. People installed more cameras, locked doors earlier, looked twice at familiar faces. Trust became conditional. The idea that safety could be assumed was gone. During the trial, the prosecution focused heavily on behavior rather than emotion. They pointed out how the suspect approached without hesitation, how there was no attempt to check surroundings, how they left the scene without urgency. These were not the actions of someone acting on impulse. These were the actions of someone who had already decided what would happen. The defense attempted to frame the act as a moment of emotional overload, a breaking point, a loss of control, but the footage contradicted that narrative. There was nothing chaotic about what the camera showed. Violence, yes, but controlled, directed, purposeful. Witnesses testified about the victim's final day. Normal conversations, routine plans, nothing to suggest they expected danger. That contrast made the crime even harder to accept. Life didn't end in a dramatic build-up. It ended in a moment no one saw coming. As the trial progressed, jurors were reminded repeatedly that cameras don't exaggerate, they don't misremember, they don't soften reality. They record exactly what happens, without emotion or bias. In this case, the camera became the most reliable witness, one that could not be intimidated or manipulated. When the verdict was read, there was no reaction from the defendant, no visible response, just the same controlled expression seen in the footage. Some interpreted it as strength, others as emptiness. Psychologists later suggested it was neither. It was detachment, a way of separating oneself from the weight of consequences. For the victim's family, the outcome brought answers, but not relief. Knowing how and why does not undo loss. It simply replaces uncertainty with a different kind of pain. They spoke about how the footage would forever exist, replayed by strangers, analyzed by experts, reduced to evidence, a final moment that could never be taken back. The neighborhood eventually returned to routine. Police tape came down, media vans left. New families moved in, unaware of what had happened there before. But for those who lived through it, the memory remained sharp. A reminder that violence doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, records itself, and leaves behind questions that linger long after justice is served. This case stands as a warning, not just about crime, but about assumptions, about how easily danger can blend into normal life, about how cameras can reveal truth, but cannot prevent intent, and about how brutality doesn't always come from chaos. Sometimes it comes from calm. Caught on camera, yes, but long before the footage rolled, the crime had already begun, growing silently in the mind of someone who believed they could act without consequence. The camera proved otherwise. It didn't stop the violence, but it ensured the truth could not be erased. And in the end, that silent witness did what no neighbor could. It saw everything.